Imagine not having to be tethered to your home computer to benefit from 2 extra displays on the road. Okay, that's sick. A display that accepts 2 HDMI or USB-C connections, is built fairly well, has a strong kickstand and hinge. The top display when set up in its tent mode auto rotates. Oh, and both displays are touchscreen as well, although macOS is a disaster for this. Alright, uPerfect sent over their Delta Max 18-inch stacked folding touchscreen for review. No money has changed hands, and outside of affiliate links that are below, they're in the description. They don't get to see this video before you do. Look, free gear is nice and all, but in the past, I have been pretty critical. But don't be fooled into thinking it's super premium. I used it once for this review, and you can see some obvious scuff marks on the top casing. That is not optimal. That can't happen. The whole purpose of using prompters is so that there's no friction points like this, and in fact, not only is it a friction point, it's a friction point that didn't exist until I got the prompter. You cannot buy the receiver on its own, and that is the only way to enable 32-bit float recording options on this microphone. And that's some gatekeeping bullshit. Look, you'll still get the truth from me, okay? I don't hold back. Let's get into this. Starting on the left side from the bottom, we have 3 USB-C ports, 1 for power and 2 more, each corresponding to their respective displays, and 2 mini HDMI ports, also for each corresponding display. They are on the left side of the unit, however, so keep this in mind when we get to the part about cables and accessories. At the middle of the monitor is this very, very strong hinge. It's very well made, it's surprisingly tight, and it allows the second monitor to be positioned either above the bottom display or folded back, and we'll talk more about that shortly. When it's in its tent orientation, it has a stiff kickstand. Here, let me turn it. Yeah, so you got this like pretty stiff kickstand, which it feels really premium, if I'm being honest. However, I feel like this could weaken over time like anything. It's subject to physics and wear and tear. But that being said, it's a strong kickstand, which really easily supports these displays when they're both upright and facing you. Awesome. Also, the tent orientation is pretty slick because watch this. Imagine you're doing a presentation with a client. You can have your notes on one side and a clean presentation feed going to the other side. So in this example, this is my Xbox on the top screen. So the Call of Duty symbol, we're going to assume for the purposes of this demonstration that these are my notes. And the Tech Mixer YouTube channel, which if you're not subscribed already, what are you doing? Hit the subscribe button. Shameless plug. Anyway, the Tech Mixer YouTube channel would be your presentation. You could actually just take this and you can turn it. If I turn you this way, you'll notice Call of Duty. Now, the keen-eyed among you may have noticed that you don't need to rotate the top screen in your computer settings. The display automatically does this, which means you could also use this as a second monitor that a friend or a colleague could plug into as well while you're working. So say you're at a coffee shop and you're studying together and both you and your friend or colleague need a second display, well, they can just pop in right there and there you go. Extremely useful. On the right side of the bottom monitor is a pair of buttons and a pair of spring-loaded buttons for monitor adjustments. I have some thoughts about this. We'll get to that as well. All in all, it does feel like a premium product, but it's not perfect, unlike what the name would imply. Yeah, that was punishing. In the box, you get a power brick rated at 44 watts, a pair of USB-C cables for data and power, and 2 mini HDMI to full-size HDMI cords, which, if I'm being honest, I would have appreciated if they were longer, especially if you're a Mac user who prefers to have their display on the left, as this cable is definitely not going to be far enough to reach if you want to use HDMI on a MacBook. I also would highly, and I mean highly, prefer that this was standard HDMI. In fact, something stupid happened, which is about to reinforce my point about this. To be honest, mini HDMI isn't great, and what would have been cool is if they had couplers that adapted mini HDMI to full-size HDMI. Even better is if this display would just adopt full HDMI ports on it, even at the expense of it being just a touch thicker. Unfortunately, I had to actually order couplers that adapt the mini HDMI to regular HDMI because, well, in the middle of setting up this entire shoot, and this is like take 15 because of a disaster earlier. Anyway, setting up the shoot, everything here collapsed. My lighting, my camera. I was rigging something and then the monitor, like it got hit by the light and it toppled to the floor. It was a disaster. I did catch everything. So luckily I caught everything and nothing was broken. Well, almost nothing. The mini HDMI to full-size HDMI is now broken on the mini side. It is completely unusable. This is the cable straight, but then look at how this bent. It's not connecting anymore. Luckily, the ports on the unit itself are fine, and I can use USB-C for one of the displays, but like most of you watching, I don't have a mini HDMI to HDMI just laying around, so I'm at the mercy of Amazon shipping. Seriously, this should either include these adapters in the box, or these types of adapters, I should say, or it should be full-size HDMI like on the monitor itself. At least the monitors didn't break when it took the full drop. So look, that's a positive. Okay, like I said, this thing is built very well. However, not saying that you can just throw this thing around. Your mileage may vary if you so happen to physically damage it. I can't promise you that it won't crack or shatter. The other thing I would have liked to have seen is one more USB-C cable. This would have been nice in the event that you need to use two USB-C cables for, say, displays, for both displays. You can power this without the included power brick via USB-C, but it will start having power issues when you set the brightness close to 50%. And obviously that won't work with an HDMI connection. Look, HDMI doesn't pass enough power to handle a display, let alone two displays. And funnily enough, I thought to myself before it arrived that maybe I could use the top monitor as like some kind of a sun hood for the bottom display. Let's see what happens. Yeah, like if I had it like this. And gravity is not being my friend today. Damn you, gravity. While we're talking about the user interface, you have a few options when displays are connected. There's clone mode, expansion, sequence, and stand-along. Stand-along, I believe, is either a typo that meant to say stand-alone or a mistranslation to mean that they stand along one another. Sure. On macOS, if you have one USB-C cable plugged in, clone mode and expansion mode perform the same function, as macOS has limitations in how it does displays. uPerfect decided to go this route, which was smart, so at least you don't get a no signal error on one monitor when you plug in one USB-C cable. To get expansion mode in macOS, you have to use two cables, but it can be a combination of USB-C and HDMI, or two of either cable. Windows users can output dual discrete displays with one cable. Thanks, Apple. You can enable sequence mode on the monitor with one cable, however, which makes the two screens one giant vertical display, although with a big seam in the center, which is obviously due to the hinge. I mean, you could use it to browse vertical content for some strange reason. Also, if you were to plug in the USB-C port off of an iPhone, it will just mirror it across all the displays in clone, expansion, and sequence mode. Stand-along or standalone mode will just put the iPhone on the display corresponding to the port you plugged it into, also mirroring the iPhone display because the iPhone doesn't have extended display support. Another user experience quirk is the actual UI. So this threw me off when I first got this. When you're making adjustments, this bar will show up on the bottom right corner, which is expected. However, you'll notice that the color of the bar when you're raising a value like brightness is gray instead of white. White in this case means it's going down in value. So it took me a few days to really get used to that. The interface has your usual array of features: brightness, contrast, black equalizer, and a game mode toggle, which can switch between options like standard, FPS, and RTS. Standard being your standard picture profile, FPS being optimized for playing high FPS games, and RTS, which apparently is good for real-time strategy games as it's a little more saturated, it's sharper, slightly better brightness and contrast. The buttons to control it are okay, but to be honest, it took me a while to get used to the button layout. I would have preferred if the buttons to control the top display were actually on the top display instead of grouped together on the bottom display. And instead of it being the spring-loaded button that you can shift up and down, my personal preference would have been physical up and down buttons and maybe an enter button in the middle. And again, if all of these were on each monitor respectively, it would probably just be a little more intuitive. I do worry that these spring-loaded buttons could fail over time, and it's probably the only part of this monitor where I question the build quality. It's the button implementation. That's the only place where I really wonder about the build quality of this display. With two glass panels, it is fairly heavy. It doesn't feel cheap by any means. The hinge that splits the screen, it is stiff, and I mentioned this before. Even if it loses stiffness over time, I can't see it like getting loose enough to get unstable, which is actually really nice. The kickstand is pretty stiff. It's really firm. And again, I can't see it posing an issue over time, even if it does lose some of its stiffness. Look, I can actually drop it like pretty close to the monitor and get you to a vertical base, and yeah, that's pretty good. The spec sheet claims a 16 millisecond gray to gray response time, which might sound low, but monitors from even back in 2018 and probably even before then can do 5 milliseconds, so I wouldn't competitively game on these panels. I would have liked to test this with a super high frame rate camera, but I don't have one, unfortunately. I don't know, maybe if I get a lot of subscribers and blow this channel up, I can, afford a camera that does like 240 frames a second or higher, and then I can go full Casey from Camera Conspiracies. Let's talk about overall brightness and viewing angles. So to show this, I'm gonna have to turn off my main light, my key light. I'm actually just gonna put you here. Before I do that, take a quick look here. Like, you're noticing the key light, you're seeing at the top the main reflection of it, but even this bottom one, you can still see my hand over it. It is very glossy. Here's a clue. The reflection is not optimal with such a glossy display, and apparently, I'm the Batman. All in all, this is a good quality display in terms of picture quality, even at 1080p, which is impressive. And I was thankful that on the unit that I received, the uniformity seemed to be the same, which shows that uPerfect cares about quality control. However, I don't think it's practical to use outdoors, as you're about to see when I re-enable my key light. This is like super shiny, and look, I'm gonna like turn it. As you're probably seeing, my reflection, you can see my overhead camera, my microphone. Yeah, this isn't great to use outdoors. I cannot see this being practical to use outdoors at all. I actually created a YouTube short to hopefully promote this video, and you'll notice when the turntable spins, the viewing angle is not great. In practice, you definitely want to be directly in front of it. The speakers aren't great. Like, for the pair, they're rated at 8 ohms and 1 watt each speaker, and it really does sound like it, if I'm being honest. For a test, let's play the same sound source from this iPhone 16 Pro Max that I have below me at maximum volume, and then replay the same audio through the speakers of the monitor. The speakers are also rear firing, which doesn't help its case, so what we're gonna do is, let me move this monitor up here, right? We got our mic about here, and I'm just gonna place my phone actually below, so it's firing this way. Watch this. Let's hit play. Apparently, Bell actually has a GigaHub 2.0, and it was leaked yesterday, and it seems to be coming soon, but... Okay, now let's go over to the monitor and see what that sounds like. Apparently, Bell actually has a GigaHub 2.0, and it was leaked yesterday, and it seems to be coming soon, but yeah, that's not great. The 3D sound option also doesn't seem to add anything from my perspective. Oh, and lastly, I could only get sound from the input of the bottom display, and nothing I tried would give me any sound from the top monitor. That is a clear miss. Also, something weird that tends to happen is, like, you see it's not oriented right. Not that you're gonna be flipping it back and forth as often, like when you're using it. Like, say you got a client presentation, it's not just gonna randomly flip. It's just because I keep moving it, so don't mind that. While we're talking about display properties here, let's talk about HDR performance. With this, I found this to be a little weird as well. The screen was darker when setting this unit to HDR with USB-C. But with HDMI, it was about the same level of brightness. And one interesting thing that happens when you enable HDR with HDMI plugged in is it gets rid of this strange error message macOS was showing me under the color profile setting, which stated, "This profile has a bad description tag." Again, this only occurred when using HDMI input in the standard dynamic range mode, where USB-C, it just didn't exhibit this issue at all. As the refresh rate is concerned, it's rated at 100 Hz, while macOS and even the on-screen display shows that it was running at 120 Hz. When I tried it as a standalone display with the lid closed on my MacBook, it felt the same as the Apple XDR display in my M3 Max MacBook Pro, so that was nice. I'm not entirely sure how to validate this, if this is actually running at 120 Hz or if it's running at 100. Let me know in the comments if you you know a way to validate this that I can do fairly easily, and maybe I can add a test via a YouTube short or a pinned comment. Regarding touch functionality, because remember, this is a touch display, macOS is odd. That's the word we're going to use today. I don't blame uPerfect for this. And the thing is that I also don't use Windows on any of my machines, so I couldn't test this. But on macOS, there's some type of driver that allows this unit to function as a touch display. So back to Batman for a moment. I'm Batman. So you'll notice that I'm dragging and nothing is happening that you can see, but my computer, which is off screen, is actually like I'm able to drag stuff. But this is where it gets really weird, okay? So right here, you'll notice I'm gonna end up on the outer bounds of the screen. Oh wait, but there's more. Where it gets even funnier, this top display is plugged into HDMI going to the Xbox. If I touch up here, for some reason, it is affecting the Mac that's plugged in with USB-C to the bottom monitor. I'm not totally sure what is causing this. Wow, that's bright. But yeah, I don't know. I really couldn't imagine using this with macOS. So this touch function is awful. And it's probably because Apple has locked it down in a certain way. Like you would expect if Apple wrote the driver to allow touch with this type of display, that gestures and all of that would work, but no such luck. In fact, it even misses when you try to tap on the screen, and it misses by a massive margin. Touch is also only enabled via USB-C, as HDMI doesn't pass the touch screen data to the computer, which is what I would say if I wasn't having this thing, which is connected with HDMI to a totally different device, but it's affecting the bottom one, which is connected to the MacBook via USB-C, but the top one is not USB-C enabled because there's no cable to it, but it affects the bottom one, while the top. It would have been nice if this monitor had a built-in battery. Mind you, it would have made it heavier and probably thicker, but luckily it supports USB power delivery. So I tested it at max brightness on both screens with a V-mount 99 watt-hour battery from Small Rig that has a USB-C port to deliver power, and I got a staggering just over 4 hours of power of video playback looping on both screens from 2 discrete inputs. That is fairly impressive. I found 2 use cases that I think will serve me well, at least it'll serve me personally. As ridiculous as this seems to be using at a coffee shop, when it's standing upright behind your laptop, it almost serves as a do not disturb portable cubicle because you're actually getting work done, not flexing. Obviously, only the top display is in use when it's in this orientation, but as far as being portable, it's surprisingly reasonable as the footprint isn't that bad, which leads me to some of the optional accessories that you can purchase for it, which uPerfect generously sent over with this unit. So we've got the U-Bag, an HDMI 2.1 adapter, which is mini 2.1, and a USB-C adapter. Now, what's interesting about these is that these are U-shaped, so you can actually tuck the cables behind the monitor for a cleaner setup. Let me show you how that works. We're gonna route it under the hinge. Now we're back on this side, and we just hook it into power, and there's our Xbox. Also notice this funky little light that shines when it's running, which means it's getting a connection. Very cool. Okay, and that cleans up the setup nicely. Obviously, same thing applies with the USB adapter, although I don't see a funky light on this one. The U-Bag is nice feeling. It has a pocket. It's actually a fairly deep pocket. You can get a bunch of cables in there, more than you're probably gonna need. And on the inside of the bag, it does have a soft texture, so you don't damage the unit. Although the version they sent over doesn't seem to have a handle like the website indicates, which is a little confusing. The handles would have been nice, but it's not the end of the world carrying this around. So use case 1 is using it on the road outside of the challenging lighting conditions. It did make productivity a little easier. Use case 2 is where these VESA mount holes come into play. Editor Sean here. This review got kind of complicated. Most of what I filmed stands true, but I want to address some things about my overall thoughts. As you're seeing on screen right now, the screws for the VESA plate don't fit. And as a sanity check, that LG monitor that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about response time is one I actually own. So for a sanity check, let's try mounting the plate to this thing to see if I'm the one who's crazy. Okay, so this side up, as it says. But here, we'll just drop this one in. Yeah, this is fitting. I just want to see if this plate actually fits, because this conforms to the VESA standard. For Canadians who know, there used to be a store back in the late 90s, early 2000s called Future Shop, and I was a technician there near the end of its run. Outside of that, I did some consulting and worked at various computer stores and things like that when I was younger. But I have mounted hundreds of VESA monitors. Matter of fact, like even the two that are in my main studio are on a dual VESA arm. And look at this, it's perfectly fine. Put this down and yep, we're good. All right, let's take this off and see if I'm crazy. So here, let's put this off the table for a moment. By the way, that monitor, that's not just laying around. That used to be the monitor that I would use to monitor myself. I'm saying monitor a lot, the monitor review, whatever. Okay, so again, we've got our up. Yeah, this is not, it doesn't matter what angle I go on. Here, let's take this thing off. We're just gonna try going straight into it. Yep, that's not tapping at all. What about this one? This one is like, yeah, it's like it's blocked by something. We're just gonna check all four while we're at it. And I'm very worried I'm gonna break something if I try to force it more, because it's not the thickest monitor in the world. Yeah, that's not happening. As a piece of hardware from a build standpoint, I've stated it repeatedly that it's built well, excluding the spring-loaded buttons that I talked about earlier in the video, and now the VESA holes not adapting correctly. And I like the design. I really do like the design of it, as there seems to be some good care and attention to detail. So I applaud uPerfect in that respect. First off, the mini HDMI thing has to go, like these things. It's a pain point. The glossy display also really should go. It's physics, okay? This is just physics. The backlight is going to fight to push through reflections, and you're probably going to want to run this at 100% brightness constantly because of it. The next thing is, I don't know if this is a hardware issue or if it can be addressed with a firmware update, but the touchscreen that's not connected to USB-C having an effect on the alternate monitor, it's odd and straight up confusing. Also odd and confusing is the refresh rate. I know you rate it at 100 Hz, but the on-screen display and the system showing 120 Hz feels a little lazy, if I'm being completely honest. Maybe there's a software limitation somewhere between macOS and the monitor that I'm not aware of. The VESA holes not being proper spec, it really feels like a quality control mishap, which is really weird considering the rest of the physical unit is pretty well in check. That, I'll be honest, that really disappointed me, because I kind of had high hopes of keeping this like in the studio using this quick release plate. And basically, let's get the receiver. So if I have the receiver, you can just pull it, take the monitor off, hang the cables over top of the receiver, and then grab this and go. So I could use it for two things. So this was actually disappointing, very disappointing in my particular use case. Not being 4K is kind of a bummer, but it wasn't unusable. And I found the color to be pleasing, even though the brightness to drive that color just wasn't there. The biggest issue I alluded to just now was the display brightness, okay? Having a glossy display didn't help, but I honestly think that with the power budget, even with the included power brick, it just isn't enough. I was able to get my work done with great ease, like fairly good ease from a productivity standpoint using this display, but sadly, this is the biggest issue that prevents me from wholeheartedly recommending this uPerfect unit. I do hope they release a version 2, or maybe another display would serve my use case that would be like height adjustable and, you know, have full-size HDMI ports. That would be nice. And while obviously the affiliate codes in the description, they're there for use with the entire site. If you can find that you could actually have this and serve your use case, or you want to purchase another item on the store, you could always use those codes below to grab a deal while supporting the channel. However, I unfortunately can't recommend this device with all the quirks, and I think uPerfect has the potential to make a great version of this. I really do. But there's a bit of improvement that needs to occur first. And full transparency, this is for uPerfect specifically. I am so sorry for two things. One, that this didn't go as well as you probably wanted it to. And two, for how late this review is, because I had a different conclusion and all that, but I ran into some of the problems that I listed in the video and had to do reshoots, and it's a whole thing. But I really do believe in uPerfect, unlike Ivanki, who I'm going to trash for the rest of my existence, I'm guessing, because I was not a fan of that product. And maybe I'll do a video where like I actually pay someone to take that thing off my hands. It's an idea I've been toying with. But anyway, if you found this video useful in any form or fashion, be it entertaining, educational, informative, whatever the case, feel free to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share it around, blah, 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 all the things. You know what to do. My name is Sean. This has been Tech Mixer, and I'm out. Peace.